Montana Territory. 1878, the wind howled hard across the high plains, kicking dust into the sky as if the land itself wanted to forget what had happened here. Calla Preston's boots crunched over the dry gravel as she reached the edge of the ranch yard. Her coat was worn thin, her hands scraped and raw from the road. She had been walking for 3 days after the last wagon train left her behind near Fort Benton. 20 years old, alone, and with nothing left but the weight of her name and the ache of hunger twisting her stomach. A barn loomed ahead, weather-beaten but solid. Beyond it, the house stood 2 stories of timber and stone, smoke curling from the chimney. Safe. That was all she needed, just a place to stop running. She had heard whispers at the last trading post. A cowboy lived out here, alone, no wife, no kin. A good man, they said. He had taken in 2 orphaned boys last winter after their parents died in a blizzard. That was enough for her to believe he might not turn her away. Calla stepped through the open gate, heart pounding. A man stepped out of the barn, rubbing sweat from his brow with a worn glove. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath his dusty coat. His dark hair curled just slightly at the collar, and his eyes clear, steady and gray-blue like the sky before snowfall met hers without flinching. "You lost?" he asked, voice deep, rough from dust and years. She swallowed, then shook her head. "No, sir, I am desperate. I am not looking for charity. I can cook, clean, men, take care of children. I will earn my keep." Or her voice cracked as the last word fought its way out. "If you want something else, I will offer myself if I have to, for safety." His face changed, not with lust, not with pity, but something quieter, sadder. He stepped closer, slow, measured. "What is your name?" "Calla Preston." "I am Zeke Porter. This is my land." He looked her over, not in hunger but in careful consideration. "You are not offering yourself to me, Miss Preston. You are not a thing to be traded. You're a woman in trouble." "That deserves respect, not shame." Calla's breath hitched. She had not expected kindness, not after everything. "I have 2 boys inside," Zeke said. "Zane and Zachary. They lost their folks last winter. I took them in. They are still healing." "I am good with children," she whispered. He nodded once. "Then come on in. You can help with supper. We will talk proper tomorrow." Her knees almost gave out. Relief came like a wave crashing against her bones. She followed him toward the house, the warmth of the wood stove already spilling through the open door. Inside, 2 boys around 8 and 10 sat at a small table drawing pictures on scraps of paper. They looked up, curious but not scared. Zeke gave them a nod. "Boys, this is Calla. She is staying with us." They both offered shy hellos. She smiled back, her voice gentle. "It is real nice to meet you both." That night, Calla stirred stew over the fire while Zeke chopped firewood outside. Her hands moved with purpose, but her mind was still spinning. She had come ready to trade her body for protection. And instead, he had given her a chair at the table. After the boys were asleep, she found Zeke out on the porch watching the stars. "I owe you," she said softly. He did not look at her. "You do not owe me anything." "I would have done it," she admitted. "Offered myself, I mean." He looked over then, eyes tired but calm. "I know. But I would never take something like that from a woman, especially one who is scared." Her throat tightened. "Why did you help me?" he shrugged. "Because I have been alone too." The silence between them stretched, not awkward, just full of everything they were both thinking. "You can stay as long as you need," he added. "We will figure the rest out later." Calla went to bed on a straw mattress in the corner of the boys' room, heart quiet but full. She had not felt safe in years. But that night, with the fire crackling and children breathing steady beside her, she finally slept without fear. Over the next few days, the rhythm of the ranch settled around her. She swept floors, baked bread, patched holes in the boys' trousers. Zeke worked the cattle and came home with dust in his hair. He never raised his voice, never looked at her like she was less than. He just saw her, like she was a person worth seeing. One afternoon, she was hanging laundry when she heard a shout from the creek. She dropped the basket and ran. Zane had slipped, his foot caught between rocks as the current tugged at him. Without thinking, Calla waded in, the icy water shocking her legs. She pulled him free, wrapping her arms around his shaking body. By the time Zeke reached them, she was already carrying the boy back up the slope. Zeke's jaw was tight. "You could have been hurt." "So could he," she said, holding Zane closer. Later, after the boys were asleep again, Zeke found her on the porch, her wet dress drying in the wind. "You are braver than I thought," he said. "I did not think, I just moved." He chuckled softly. "That is how love works sometimes." She looked over, startled. "Love," he turned toward her, serious now. "I do not know what this is yet, but I know the way you just ran for that boy like he was yours. That meant something." Calla's heart thudded hard against her ribs. "I have nothing to give you." "That is not true," he said. "You give those boys a mother's care, you give this place warmth, you give me a reason to come home at night." She blinked fast. "You really mean that?" "I do." He stepped closer, slow and careful, like every move was a promise. He took her hand, rough against her smoother one. "I will never take anything from you that you do not give freely," he said. "But if you ever decide to give me your heart, I will take care of it like it is gold." Calla looked up at him, wind tugging her hair loose. "Then maybe I already have." And he smiled, not wide, not showy, just real. The stars above them burned bright, but nothing shone like the hope rising between them. The first frost came early that year, dusting the edges of the pasture with a silver hush that lingered past sunup. Calla pressed her palm to the windowpane before dawn, the cold seeping through the glass. The boys were still under quilts in the next room, their soft breathing a comfort she hadn't known she'd come to count on. Down in the kitchen, she lit the stove and set to kneading dough for the morning's bread. Her hands moved without thought now, the rhythm of domestic work settling into her bones like it had always belonged there. The oats were low, which meant she'd need to plan a trip to town. She didn't like the idea of leaving the children behind, even for half a day. She heard the barn door creak open and the sound of boots brushing through hay. Zeke was already out with the horses. A week had passed since the evening on the porch, and though neither of them had spoken again of hearts or promises, something had shifted. He lingered longer in conversation. His touch, when it passed in small ways, handing her a tin cup, helping her down from the wagon, was always steady, always warm. And he watched her now, not with caution or curiosity, but quiet recognition. Zeke came in just as the boys were rubbing sleep from their eyes. Mud streaked his sleeves and he smelled of clean sweat and cedar bark. He leaned near the stove and accepted a mug of coffee, nodding once in thanks. "We'll need to take the wagon to town," she said. "Flour's near gone. We've got enough left for today, but no more." His gaze moved to the boys. "I'll stay back with them. You'll have more room for supplies that way. You trust me with the team, you've got a steady hand. Besides, folks in town might talk less if I'm not beside you." She blinked. "Talk?" Single man and woman showing up together, living under one roof. "People guess before they ask." Calla folded a cloth over the fresh loaves. "Let them. I've learned not to care what people say." Zeke didn't smile, but something softened in his face. "Still, you'll have fewer eyes on you if it's just you and the wagon. I'll mind the boys. You be back before dusk." The road to town was long and rutted, lined with bare cottonwoods and the last clinging leaves. The horses pulled steady and Calla sat tall on the bench, coat buttoned high, scarf tucked close. Her reflection in the mercantile's window startled her. She wasn't the same girl who'd arrived dusty and desperate. There was color in her cheeks now, weight in her walk. She paid for the flour, sugar, and a bolt of thick wool with the coins Zeke had set aside in a tin marked household. The shopkeeper, a widow named Mrs. Elkins, gave her a slow once-over before bagging her goods. "You're living out on the Porter place?" "I am." Mrs. Elkins tied the last parcel. "He's a quiet man, keeps to himself, good with his hands." Calla lifted a sack into the wagon bed, and with his heart. The older woman's brows lifted, but she said only, "Well, that's rare enough, ride careful." The sun had dipped low by the time the cabin came into view again. Zeke stood near the fence, wiping his hands on a rag. He reached for the reins as she climbed down, eyeing the supplies with approval. Boys behaved. They helped mend the chicken coop, didn't complain once. Inside, Zachary was showing Zane how to fold paper into boats. Calla set the parcels on the table and began unpacking. Zeke lingered by the doorway. "You're a hard worker," he said, "but I don't want you thinking you have to earn your place here every day." She looked up from the sugar sack. "Then let me ask you something, all right? Do you see me as a guest?" "No." "Then what am I, Zeke?" He didn't fumble. "You're a woman I admire, one I'm learning to care for." She stood still in the quiet that followed. Outside, the wind moved through dry grass like a whisper. "I'm not used to being wanted for anything other than what I can give," she said. "You're not here because of what you give," he answered. "You're here because you belong." Calla stepped closer. "You said something about hearts once. I remember." "If I gave you mine," she said, voice low, "what would you do with it?" He didn't look away. "I'd put a ring on your hand and never let you doubt it again." Her breath caught. "You already have one." "I do." Zeke reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was a simple gold band, no stone, no flourish, just clean, honest metal. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it through drought and sickness and every hard year. Held our family together with it. I reckon it carries more than weight." Calla held out her hand, palm open. Her fingers trembled. "If you're sure," she whispered. Zeke slid the ring onto her finger, his hands rough and certain. "I've been sure since the night you walked through my gate." She leaned in then, forehead resting against his chest, the steady beat beneath it anchoring her. "Will the boys understand?" she asked. "They already do," he said. "Zachary asked yesterday if you'd be his mama now." Her arms wrapped around him, slow and full. "Then I reckon I already am." Zeke rested his chin against her hair, and for the first time in years, Calla didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was home. By late November, the wind had turned sharp, tugging at the eaves and setting the shutters to creaking. Calla stood at the edge of the field with a shawl wrapped snug around her shoulders, watching as Zeke and the boys pushed the last of the firewood into the lean-to. The horses had been blanketed and stabled early, their breath rising in soft puffs against the chill. Inside, the house had begun to smell of dried herbs and winter apples. Calla had tied bunches of thyme and sage in the kitchen rafters, and jars of preserved peaches lined the shelf above the stove. The work had been steady, the kind that kept her hands full and her thoughts quiet. That evening, as she stitched a new hem to Zachary's Sunday shirt, Zeke sat across the table with a ledger open, pencil tapping against the margin. "You've been looking at that page for 15 minutes, she said without glancing up. He leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. "Trying to figure how to stretch what's left through March. Feed's gone up again." "What about the pelts?" "You've got near a dozen from that last trap run. They'll fetch something, but not enough to cover everything. I've been thinking on taking a drive south. There's a buyer in Billings who pays fair if you show up in person." Calla set her sewing aside. "That's 3 days each way. I'd leave the boys with you just after Christmas once the worst of the storms pass." She nodded once. We'll manage, but Zeke, don't go if it ain't needful. He gave a quiet breath, not quite a sigh. It's not hunger I'm worried about, it's dignity. I want them boys growing up knowing they've got steady ground under them. Calla stood and crossed to where he sat, laying a hand on his shoulder. They already know that, because of you. His hand came up to cover hers, warm and calloused. Because of us. Later that week, Calla took the boys down to the creek bend where the ice had begun to form along the shallows. She packed a basket with biscuits and smoked meat, and they built a small fire in the lee of a rock wall. Zane found a hollow branch and tried to carve it into a whistle while Zachary balanced flat stones on the ice, testing how far they'd slide. Calla sat with her back to a pine, mending gloves and listening to the soft murmur of their play. "Miss Calla," Zane said after a while, "when the snow comes, will you still sleep in our room?" She met his eyes. "Would you like me to?" He nodded. "It feels safer." She smiled gently. "Then I will." When they returned home, the sun had already dipped low, and the light in the windows cast long golden stripes across the snow-dusted yard. Zeke met them at the door, lifting Zachary's bundle and brushing a leaf from Calla's sleeve. "You were out longer than I expected." "We found a rabbit trail and followed it a ways," she said. "Didn't catch anything, but it led us to a good view." He helped her out of her coat. "You've got a way of turning a cold afternoon into something kind." As the first snowstorm rolled in, Zeke moved his cot from the loft down to the parlor, giving Calla the upstairs room. She protested at first, but he only said, "It's warmer near the stove anyway," and left it at that. The days grew shorter, the wind sharper. Calla taught the boys how to darn socks and steep pine needles for tea when their throats got raw. Zeke built a sled from scrap wood, and they took turns gliding down the hill behind the barn, whooping until their cheeks flushed red. One night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Zeke knocked gently on the frame of her door. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "I know we're already promised, but I'd like to do it proper, with the boys there. Maybe even ask Reverend Tolley to come out after the thaw." Calla stepped closer, fingers brushing against the edge of his coat. "You want a church wedding? I want you to have whatever makes you feel like you've been chosen right." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "Then yes." "In spring, with the earth waking up again." He touched her cheek, just once. "You've made this house something I didn't know I was missing. And you made it safe enough for me to become myself again." They stood in the hush of the hallway, the fire downstairs crackling just softly enough to remind them they weren't alone in the world anymore. Come morning, the first deep snow would cover the pasture fence, and the boys would wake to a world remade in white. But for now, in the quiet warmth of the home they'd built together, every promise had already taken root. The snow held through January, settling thick across the hills and muffling every sound under its weight. Calla woke early each day to the hush of it, the chimney's low draft murmuring above her, the boys' footsteps trailing soft along the hall. She'd begun teaching them letters by lamplight, using a Bible she found tucked behind a row of jars in the pantry. Zeke had never said much about religion, but when he saw her reading aloud to the boys, he started sitting in, folding his long frame onto the bench without a word. One afternoon, while the boys built a fort from split wood and a canvas tarp, Zeke handed Calla a tin box from the loft. "Found this when I was looking for the old harness straps," he said. Inside were 2 folded letters, brittle with age, and a photograph faded around the edges. A woman in a high-collared dress stood beside a narrow-faced man, a baby bundled in her arms. Zeke tapped the corner of the photo. "My sister, Sarah. She died the spring I turned 21. Her husband went under a horse not long after that. The baby didn't make it through the second winter." Calla traced the outline of the woman's face with her eyes. "You never said you had family. Didn't seem worth saying," he replied. "Not until now." She looked up. "Why now?" "Because you're the first person I've wanted to share it with. And because I think you ought to know where the quiet in me comes from." Calla closed the box gently. "I don't mind the quiet. It's where the truth usually lies." The next few days passed in rhythm. Chores ran shorter in the cold, but there was always something to mend, something to prepare. The cabin felt smaller in winter, but not in a way that pressed. More like the walls had drawn in to hold them tighter. One morning, while Calla was brushing a knot from Zane's hair, Zachary sat at the table, watching her with an expression too old for his face. "Are you gonna have a baby?" he asked, the brush stilled in her hand. "Why do you ask something like that? Some of the boys at town school said married ladies always do." Calla glanced toward the window where Zeke was splitting kindling. "Not every family looks the same, Zachary," he frowned. "But I think it would be good. You're good at being a mama." Calla knelt in front of him, smoothing his sleeve. "If it happens, it happens. But you two are plenty for my heart already." That night, after the boys had gone to bed, she told Zeke what Zachary had asked. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "He's thinking ahead." "I wasn't expecting it," she said, "but I didn't mind." Zeke studied her for a long moment. "I'd like a child with you if you'd want that." She met his gaze. "I would, but I don't need it to feel complete." He nodded once. "Neither do I. But the thought of a little one between us, it feels like belonging stretched further." Their fingers met across the table, the silence between them full and easy. Late February brought a thaw, the kind that made the ground soft and the roof drip steady through the mornings. Zeke began walking the fence line again, checking for winter damage. One afternoon, he came in with a limp and a bloodied knee. "Barbed wire caught me," he said, lowering himself onto the bench. Calla knelt beside him, rinsing the wound with boiled water. "You ought to be more careful," she murmured. He winced but didn't pull away. "Didn't see the post leaning. You should have waited, sent me or one of the boys with you." He looked down at her hands, steady as they stitched the gash. "You sound like someone who's used to worrying." "I've had enough people leave to know what it feels like. I don't care to repeat it." His voice was softer then. "I'm not going anywhere, Calla." The next day, he stayed indoors, watching from the window as she hauled water and stacked kindling. It bothered him to sit idle, she could tell, but he didn't complain. That evening, she found him in the parlor, sorting through a stack of folded shirts. "You don't have to do that," she said. He held one up. "I can't sew, but I can organize." She smiled and sat beside him, resting her shoulder against his. "You do enough. I want to do more." She reached for his hand. "Then grow old with me, that's enough." Outside, the wind had calmed. The trees stood bare but strong, reaching skyward in the blue hush of approaching dusk. And inside, with the fire burning low and the boys reading aloud from the Bible by lantern light, Zeke and Calla sat side by side in the quiet they'd built together, no longer borrowed, no longer uncertain. Just theirs. By March, the earth released its grip on the snow, and the cabin's roof sang with meltwater. The pasture turned to muck, and the creek swelled its banks, brown with runoff and quick with thaw. Calla watched the land change from the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the soft wool damp where her damp hair dripped from washing. Inside, the boys argued gently over a game of checkers while Zeke restrung a broken snowshoe near the hearth. The house felt full not just with voices and footfalls, but with the kind of ease that came from people who'd grown close without forcing it. That afternoon, Zeke handed her a folded piece of paper. "Came by the post rider this morning. It's from the circuit preacher." Calla opened it carefully. "He'll be through in 2 weeks," Zeke nodded. "We can say our vows then if you still want that." She studied him quietly. You haven't asked if I've changed my mind. You'd tell me if you had. I haven't, she said. But I'd like to be wet outside if the ground dries enough. There's a spot above the south field, he offered. Birch trees, bit of open sky. Calla touched his wrist, fingers light. That's the one. The next days were filled with small preparations. Calla let the boys polish 2 old boots she hadn't worn since arriving, and she stitched a ribbon onto the collar of her plainest dress. Zeke trimmed his beard with a hunting knife and borrowed a pressed shirt from a neighbor who came by with eggs and well wishes. On the morning of the wedding, the sky hung high and pale, the wind stirring the birch branches just enough to carry the smell of damp bark. The preacher arrived on horseback, his coat brushed clean but his boots soaked through. He shook Zeke's hand and tipped his hat to Calla, saying only, "Don't need a church to make a promise." They stood in the open clearing, the boys on either side, and spoke their vows with the steady voices of people who had already lived the truth of them. No guests, no music. Just words spoken plain and eyes held fast. When the preacher said, "Man and wife," Zeke bent and kissed her, not quick, not showy, just certain. The boys clapped hard enough to stir the trees. That evening, Calla tucked them into bed with extra quilts and stories about a fox who learned to trust a sparrow. When she returned downstairs, Zeke had lit the oil lamp and set 2 tin cups on the table. He poured warm cider from the kettle, motioned for her to sit. "I didn't get you a ring," she said, watching him sip. "You gave me a home," he replied. "That's more than gold." She reached across the table and laced her fingers through his. "You gave me a name that means something." They sat like that for a long while, not saying much. The kind of quiet that came after something whole had been built. Spring came slow but sure. The fence posts dried out. The hens laid more regular. Calla planted beans and cabbage in neat rows, while Zeke dug a second garden bed for herbs. The boys took turns hauling water and chasing the neighbors' goats back to their pen. One night, just after supper, Calla leaned against the doorframe while Zeke swept the kitchen. "I've been feeling off," she said softly. He paused, broom still in hand. "Sick, tired mostly. Hungry at odd hours. I was late last month." He set the broom aside. "Do you think? I'm almost sure." Zeke stepped forward, his face unreadable except for the light in his eyes which caught like flame. "Are you glad?" "I didn't know I could be," she said. "But yes." He pulled her close, his hand settling at her back. "Then we'll ready the house for 5. The next weeks passed in a hush of preparation. Zeke reinforced the loft ladder and Calla stitched a cradle quilt from scraps of the boys' old shirts. She didn't tire easily, not yet, but Zeke took on the heavier work without being asked. When she caught him smoothing a hand over the doorframe of the small room off the kitchen, she didn't say a word. She only stood beside him and they looked inside together. The boys grew quiet at first, unsure. But one morning, Zane brought her a handful of wildflowers, dirt still clinging to the roots. "For when the baby comes," he said. "So it knows we're waiting." Zachary added, "We can help too. We know how to rock a cradle." Calla crouched to hug them both tightly, the smell of sun and soil in their shirts. By the time the summer fields turned gold, the house had settled into a new kind of rhythm. One where the future didn't feel like something to brace for, but something to lean toward. On a warm August morning, with the windows open and the late breeze stirring the curtains, Calla gave birth to a daughter. Zeke stayed close, quiet but steady, holding her hand through each hour. When the crying came a sharp, strong sound, he wept without shame. They named her Miriam, after Zeke's mother. Her hair was dark like Calla's and her fists curled tight at her chest like she was already ready to hold on. That night, with Miriam sleeping between them and the boys curled on a pallet nearby, Zeke brushed Calla's temple with his lips. "You gave me a life I didn't know I needed." She turned toward him, eyes heavy but bright. "You gave me a place to become myself. That's more than I ever dreamed." They lay together under the low hum of a summer night, their hands joined over the small weight of new life, the warmth between them quiet and full. The years ahead would hold work, of course they would. Cattle to drive, fences to mend, lessons to teach. But none of it would be faced alone. And in the house they'd built from silence and care, where every room held something earned, Zeke and Calla lived out their days side by side. Not rescued, not saved, just chosen. Day after day, year after year, together. Always.